Welcome, everybody, back to our Bible study. We are in the book of Acts. This is part 8. We're going to be wrapping up in the month of May, actually, so we're drawing toward a close. Chapters 18 to 24. I believe I said this last week, but if you haven't, we're getting to be a lot more factual point in the Bible, so we can cover some of the ground faster. There's a little less to dive into because it's a lot more cut and dry. But if you do have questions, feel free to post them below or send an email. In our Friday podcast, I'll be happy to kind of discuss with anything that comes up that I might have glossed over. Also, as our daily devotionals go throughout the week, they'll be covering some points in a little more detail than I may have. If you haven't seen all of our other stuff, feel free to subscribe. You should see it somewhere down below. You can like it, you can share, you can click the little bell button, all kinds of stuff to get notified on YouTube. And you also might even find us on Facebook. Picking up, we covered Paul's first and second missionary journeys last week. And so now the third missionary journey, again, here is a map that you may or may not be able to see great, but you can find lots of these online. A quick Google search of Paul's third missionary journey will bring you. And a rough outline is Galatia and Phrygia, Ephesus, Macedonia and Greece, Troas, Miletus. He makes a nice big circular loop, being much more efficient. There are lots of little nuances that happen in each of these locations. In general, Paul arrives in a place, he speaks to the Jews, he speaks to the Gentiles. There's often troubles. He establishes new churches. One of the things, though, that I do want to emphasize is Ephesus. When Paul gets to Ephesus, he stays there actually for about 2 years. He spends quite a lot of time in Ephesus speaking to them, establishing the church, really pastoring the church there in Ephesus. And coincidentally, Ephesus is in Asia, or Asia Minor as it's sometimes referred to. If you look, these 7 cities are actually all very close to Ephesus. These are the 7 cities that are mentioned in Revelation. I'll go to Revelation chapter 1, 2, and 3, talk about the 7 churches in Asia Minor. And you can see them all kind of close in this area. I think the connection there to make is that while Paul is stationary in an area for a while, he's not necessarily stationary. He's in communication with other places. People are coming to him. We know that there are times where he calls for elders, specifically for Ephesus, to come meet him places. You can infer that he may have taken quick little trips to these places, or he may have called their elders them. But even while he's semi-stationed in Ephesus as a missionary, the rest of the area does experience growth in the church just because he's present in the region. There's also another really interesting story here in this time where as Paul is spreading the gospel and is preaching, there are these 7 brothers. They're called the 7 sons of Sceva. And what they say as they encounter a demonically possessed person, they say, in the name of Jesus who Paul preaches. And so they actually see the power being manifest in the life of Paul and the things that he's doing to affect change, and are actually trying to reference, hey, just like Paul does it. And the text goes on to explain that, hey, I've heard of Jesus, I've heard of Paul, but who are you? Who are you? And this demon-possessed individual actually chases these 7 brothers away because the biblical pattern as a whole is not about reciting some kind of formula or saying the right things in the right way or referencing the right people, even if that person is Jesus. The biblical pattern is having a personal relationship with God that allows us to do things that a regular mere mortal couldn't do, but as a person filled with the Spirit of God, that we're able to go into a region, and even if we're semi-stationary, that an entire region can be affected for the gospel because of the power of Christ living inside of us, not because you said the right words in the right way. We've looked at 3 missionary journeys from Paul. This is a bit of internet digging, so I want everyone to take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but I do find it kind of interesting. It talks about the first, second, and third missionary journeys. It gives a rough distance for them. It gives the amount of time it would take to travel those locations. The website down here, openbible.info, talks a little bit about the methodology of calculating it. Yeah, these people know a whole lot more than I do, and they put a lot more effort into it than I did. So I just say, this seems reasonable to me, but I wouldn't really vouch for its authenticity to no end. But it does give you an idea of what a cost would be. One of these would probably be roughly equal to a day's wage. So you can get an idea of the cost of the travel. And I just thought it was kind of a neat little anecdote, add some life to the voyage. The third missionary journey that we just wrapping up would have been about 3,300 miles, which is a tremendous amount of distance even to cover like in an airplane. Imagine covering it on boat and on foot, maybe on donkey or camel if you got lucky for a segment. I find it interesting. You can check it out on your own if you want a lot more info about that. So after Paul's 3 missionary journeys, he finds himself back in Jerusalem. He's here to kind of return back to the home base to touch in with the church. And so Acts chapter 20, as you're traveling, there's this little interesting tidbit. Verse 8, it says, Paul went by land to Ephesus, where he arranged for us to join him. There's only a couple of little sections here in Acts where you get this us, this plural. For us, while we traveled by ship, he joined us there and we sailed together. This is referring to at least Luke, the author of the book of Luke and the author of Acts. And so when he's here, it's great because he switches into this personal pronoun that we get like just a cool taste of travel. In fact, we'll see, I think it's chapter 26, 27, 28, that area, that Luke again joins Paul and does some of this us stuff again. And this is actually toward wrapping up the last of the voyage. I don't know that there's a lot of other places anywhere in the rest of the New Testament that we get that kind of voice of the author. It's interesting to me in that it's kind of unique. Chapter 21, now when we've arrived back in Jerusalem. So Paul has returned to Jerusalem, and so the first thing he does, or one of the first things is, he goes to the temple. He heads back to the temple. He wants to get back to the center of worship. Even though a Jew who was away from the temple had ways to worship, being at the temple was still an integral part of worship. So as soon as he had the opportunity to get back to the temple, he was quick to do so. I think maybe right now I can relate to that in a way that I haven't been able to ever before. There are things that we do right now to still be the church together and to still recognize that it's more than just a building. But I can say that I'm really excited to get back into this building with all of you and be able to be together again. So anyway, Paul heads over there. There's Jews from the province of Asia who saw Paul in the temple. Right, we just talked about how he's been there. Funny that they call it the province of Asia. That's a Roman province. We just talked about how long he was in that area, how much of an impact he had. Now, shortly after leaving, he finds himself back in Jerusalem, and immediately some Jews from that area see Paul there. So those men, they roused a mob against him, and they grabbed him, verse 28, yelling, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who preaches against our people everywhere and tells everybody to disobey the Jewish law." Right? They finally see him, I guess, maybe because they were outside of the city, that they had a group of non-Christian Jews present, that for whatever reason, it seemed to these guys that this was a great time to try to raise up a stir, to try to rebel or incite riot against Paul. Verse 31, as they were trying to kill him, word reached the commander of the Roman regiment that all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. If we go way back to like week 2, I tried to give a better picture of the way that the politics worked. And essentially, there is a Roman garrison here whose job it is to keep the peace, however necessary. So when the people in the temple start an uproar, they want to immediately react. The people are everywhere. They're fighting. The soldiers come in. So verse 35, as Paul reached the stairs, the mob grew so violent, the soldiers had to lift him up onto their own shoulders just to protect him. And the crowd followed behind, shouting, "Kill him, kill him." Right, they're in a total mob justice kind of a way. But the soldiers, the police, so to speak, have come in and are bringing him to the rescue. They're going to take him out of the situation, and they're going to try to come back the next day and figure it out. Or perhaps the next chapter. Chapter 22, Paul has asked for permission to address them, actually before he goes into the garrison, before the day's over, to address the crowd. And he spoke to the crowd, but what ends up happening while he speaks to the crowd is they get angry again. They're even more excited. So the crowd listened to Paul up until that point. Then they all began to shout, "Away with such a fellow. He isn't even fit to live." They yelled, threw off their coats, and tossed handfuls of dust into the air. Threw off their coats. Remember, just a couple chapters ago, it was Stephen, the first martyr who they wanted to kill, and they threw off their coats at Saul's feet. All right, so we have a very powerful callback to a previous instance where the people, the devout Jews, are so fervent over what a Christian is saying, who is blaspheming in their mind, that they are ready to kill him in that moment. And as a part of throwing off their coats, they grab the dust of the ground, they grab the dirt, and they throw it up into the air. It doesn't say they necessarily threw it right back onto themselves, but there are other biblical illustrations where they throw the dust back onto their own heads. After Job's family has died and his friends show up to mourn, that's one of the things they do, is to throw dust up onto themselves. It seems to be a cultural practice for expressing grief and anger and outrage and mourning. It's just rather than just screaming, it's a physical kind of a thing. The Bible also in several places talked about they would rent their garments, they would tear their shirt, right? Just a way of expressing visibly the outrage and the anguish and all the emotion that they're now throwing the dirt up into the air. The commander, who's seeing that there is this group of people who are outraged and literally want to kill this guy, whom the commander doesn't seem to have any idea who he is, the commander brought Paul inside and ordered him lashed with whips to make him confess his crime. Apparently, the idea of due process doesn't quite yet exist in the Roman world, and so they have a prisoner who they want the information out of, and hey, I got some guards, get me the story that I want no matter what. He wanted to find out why the crowd had become so furious. But Paul apparently had enough of this and is not really feeling it. Says rather poignantly, "Is it lawful for you to whip a Roman citizen?" There's no reason for the Romans, the legion, to think that this guy is a citizen. But once Paul claims that he is a citizen, well, the rules have essentially changed, or maybe now better said, there are some rules. And so neither the commander nor any of the regular Roman guards want to beat up on Paul, who is now claiming to be a Roman citizen, because it's one thing in the Roman mindset to hold the people, the occupied nation, down, to beat up on them. It's a very different thing to beat up on a citizen. And while the captain says, it cost me a lot to become a citizen, the regular guards probably aren't even citizens. So, right, we see this pecking order of Jewish person down here at the bottom, occupied, occupier, Roman citizen. All of a sudden, Paul went from the bottom tier to the top tier, and everyone's kind of like, oh, well, just kidding. The next day, the commander ordered the leading priests into session with the Jewish high council. So he basically said, let's figure this out. Everybody show up at this time. We're going to have an aisle, and we'll bring the prisoner. So jumping over to chapter 23, Paul gets there. They start the process over again, maybe a little more organized than the process from the day before, but they let Paul speak again. And he seems to have this really great knack of kind of getting the people started. And he says, you guys are just mad because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Paul is very well informed, and he knows that Pharisees believe in this, Sadducees don't. The ruling council happens to be made up of these two parties. So there's such a great uproar, verse 9, because of this. Some of the teachers of religious law who were Pharisees, the same group that Paul had been, jumped up and began to argue forcefully. We see nothing wrong with him, right? This guy is of our political persuasion, basically. This guy's fine. Perhaps a spirit or an angel spoke to him. As the conflict grew more violent, the commander was afraid they would tear Paul apart. So he ordered his soldiers to go and rescue him again by force and take him back to the fortress. So we've had the same thing happen twice in a row. Paul gets here, it's chaos, right? He just seems to be gifted. Also, the same thing that happened a lot of times as he was traveling throughout on his missionary journeys. So we're jumping to verse 20. Paul's nephew comes and tells him, some Jews are going to ask you to bring Paul, him being the commander, not Paul, ask you to bring Paul before the high council tomorrow, pretending they want to get more information, right? They're going to say, hey, we want to do a third day of depositions. Can we have another round of this? But don't do it. There are more than 40 men hiding along the way, ready to ambush him. This group had gotten together. They said, you know what, we're not going to eat or drink until we see Paul dead. They clearly know the route of how to go from place to place, and they're going to ambush Paul, but assumedly also whoever brings him, right? Whatever soldiers, whatever men. We don't clearly know if they care about the soldiers, if they want to kill everybody, or if they're just looking to kill Paul. But regardless, there's a group of 40 guys who are definitely taking things seriously here. So once Paul's nephew tells the Romans this, we jump over to chapter 23, the commander called two of his officers and ordered, get 200 soldiers ready to leave at 9 o'clock tonight. Take 200 spearmen and 70 mounted troops. Also provide horses for Paul to ride. Get him safely to the governor. Clearly, the Roman legion here at the fortress are not willing to take any chances. We've established that this man is a Roman citizen. We can't bring him back to the Sanhedrin. I'm going to send him off to the governor with an escort of almost 500 soldiers, 10 to 1 trained warriors against the theoretical 40 armed ambushers, and they're going somewhere else. And they're heading out at 9 o'clock at night in darkness and giving Paul horses, plural, so that if he was fleeing and one horse was tired of running, he could just change horses. I mean, it's not quite foolproof, but it seems like a real good plan against just 40 dudes trying to ambush you. They send a letter with Paul to the governor, and it basically says, this guy was seized by some Jews. They wanted to kill him when I arrived, found out he was a Roman citizen, so I took him to safety. Of course, the legion there is the hero. I took him to their high council to try to learn what it was, and I soon discovered the charge was something regarding their religious law. I don't know what his problem was. I don't know what they're talking about. It all sounds crazy to me. But he says, certainly nothing worthy of imprisonment or death. But when I was informed of a plot to kill him, I immediately sent him on to you. I have told his accusers to bring their charges before you. And we just talked a moment ago about how we can see a similarity in Paul's story to Stephen the martyr. I see some similarities here to what's happening with Jesus, right? They have this guy they don't know. All the leaders have a problem with him. It doesn't seem like there's really a big deal. Well, I don't want to be on the hook for this. Let me pass him up the chain to the next Roman higher up and say, well, here's a quick little letter. Here's what I find. Would you figure this out for me? So in a nutshell, 5 days later, the Jews, the high priest, they even bring a lawyer, because you got to have a lawyer, show up to present their case against Paul to Felix, the governor. Paul, again, gives his defense, mentions being a follower of the way, which is a reference to Jesus, which is a reference to Christianity, right? So when Felix heard it, he was familiar with the way. He probably understood that, hey, it's a Christian Jewish thing, though they weren't necessarily using those terms. He adjourned the hearing, saying, "Wait until the garrison commander arrives, then I will decide the case." He ordered an officer to keep Paul in custody, but, and this is key, give him some freedom, allow his friends to visit him, and take care of his needs. Doesn't sound like it's necessarily so bad, except he also hoped that Paul would bribe him. So he sent for him quite often and talked with him. After 2 years went by in this way, right? Felix, apparently quite secure, is willing to hold Paul there, hoping for some kind of bribe. Maybe he's thinking that the Christians, the way, will be willing to bribe him. Maybe because he knows that Paul, who was kind of a nobody in his mind, turns out to be a Roman citizen. Well, the family must have some connections or some money. Maybe they'll bribe him. Probably thinking, all it costs me is a little extra dinner and a couple guards, so what's the big deal? Paul gets left there for 2 years. We refer to this as being under house arrest because he's not free to leave the compound, but he's not quite chained to a wall in a dungeon. I know that, personally now, I don't think I can quite identify with this, but I think I have at least a little bit better understanding. And even just me personally, being stuck in quarantine thinking, God, there were things that I was doing that I understood to be your plan, and I thought that I knew what you wanted me to do in the direction that you wanted me to go. Paul's been on 3 missionary journeys. He spent years spreading the gospel. At this point, he's had the biggest influence on the spread of Christianity over anyone except for Jesus. He's doing stuff. He's out. He's moving and shaking. And all of a sudden, he finds himself in like a holding pattern, a timeout kind of a situation. The only thing I can point back to for some bit of hope, for some light at the end of the tunnel, is that even in the midst of his imprisonment, it says, give him some freedom and allow his friends to visit him. And so I'm going to have to infer that for 2 years, Paul figures out new ways to spread the gospel. He figures out ways to call people to him instead of where he had just spent 3 big voyages going to them. That he is now having to take what he is able to do, which is less than he wanted and not what he thought it would be, and share the gospel that way. Well, I think I can take some inspiration from that and say, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I hoped for. It's not what I imagined it would be. But while I find myself here, God, I'm going to have to trust you. I'm going to have to allow you to work through me. Help me to find ways to continue your plans and purposes for my life. So Lord, we thank you for another opportunity to study your word. God, I pray that the way that you helped Paul thousands of years ago, that you would help us the same way today. Help us to change our mindset, to change our perspective, to change the methods that we had. God, help us to be creative. Help us to find new ways to share your word. Help us to be confident that you are in control of our situation and that you are the God over all of our circumstances. God, we thank you for your faithfulness, and we pray it in your name. Amen. God bless.